بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم أخرجني من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمني من نور الفهم اللهم افتح علينا أبواب رحمتك وانشر علينا خزائن علومك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. We continue our discussion about aql or intellect or reason as one of the sources for understanding rulings. We said there are purely intellectual rulings and mustaqillatul aqliyah means aql is mustaqil, intellect is independent. Minor premise and major premise both are taken from aql. Like ihsan is good or justice is good. Ihsan means benevolence. Justice or ihsan, they are good. You don't need to learn this from Quran or Hadith. You understand it by your aql. Yes? When Allah says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَأْمُرُ بِالْعَدْلِ وَالْإِحْسَانِ وَإِيتَاءِ ذِي الْقُرْبَى, this is emphasis. So even those who are not religious, they understand and they are expected to observe justice and benevolence. Okay? So, al-adlu hasanun or al-ihsanu hasan. Then, if something is hasanun aqlan, we say it is also hasanun shar'an. Religion also recognizes this. You don't need to be in doubt. Is this also something that our religion accepts? Maybe it is just my intellect, not my religion. You say, no. Anything which is acceptable to reason is acceptable to religion. Anything which is good intellectually is good religiously. Anything which is obligatory intellectually is obligatory Islam. So if it is hasanun aqlan, it's hasanun shar'an. If it is wajibun aqlan, it's wajibun shar'an. So if it is recommended or it's good religious intellectually, it's good religiously. If it is obligatory intellectually, it's obligatory religiously. Anyway, there is a kind of mulazama, correlation. Sometimes everything can be understood by aql. Then we say, okay, the same judgment is made by shar, by religion. This is al-mustaqillatul aql. Sometimes we said it's not mustaqillah, it's ghayrul mustaqillah. Means aql is there, but not purely aql. We need also a religious input. So we take one premise from aql, another premise from religion. For example, we know Hajj is wajib. But then there are things that intellectually we understand they are needed for performance of Hajj. You say these are prerequisite for Hajj, and prerequisite of wajib is wajib. Muqaddamatul wajib wajib. Or for example, inshallah later we will discuss about al-ijza. Ijza. For example, if you are in a situation when there is no water and you do tayammum and you do your salat, later you find water, do you need to repeat your salat with wuzu or tayammum was okay and your salat is okay? Ijza means what was done in that condition is sufficient. Okay? And of course there are many types of ijza that inshallah we'll talk about it. Or for example, dalalatun nahi ala al-fasad. If something is prohibited, does it mean that it is also void? For example, if you are told, do not say your prayer in a house which belongs to someone else, and he's not happy. If you are told not to do this, does it mean that in addition to committing a sin, your salat is also void? Or you have committed a sin and your salat is okay? So this is an issue. Dalalatun nahi ala fasad. Normally ulama say, if it is for ibadat, it means it's void. If it is for mu'amalat, still the transaction can be valid, but you have committed a sin. Okay? We will discuss about this. Or ijtima'ul amr wal nahi. If at the same time that you are commanded to do something, you are also prohibited of doing something else, and now they have come together. For example, you say your salat in a way that you are also disobeying another religious ruling. Okay? For example, there is saleh, there is also la taqsib. Do not, use property of someone else. They have come together. These are issues that, inshallah, we will discuss. But in many of these issues, what we have is we have religious rulings plus aql who talks about requirements or implications of these religious rulings. So this is not mustaqillat. This is ghayrul mustaqillat, because part of it's a religious ruling, part of it is intellectual ruling. But what is important is whether it is purely intellectual, or it's partially intellectual, partially religious, the overall result is agreeable to religion, to Sharia. Why? Because كلما حكم به العقل حكم به الشرع وكلما حكم به الشرع حكم به العقل. This is قاعدة الملازمة. Mulazama, I sometimes translate as correlation. It's mutual relation or co-implication. This requires this, that also requires this. It's mulazama. It's not that one requires the other. It's from both sides. If judgment is made by intellect, the same is made by religion. If it is made by religion, the same is by intellect. So whatever Quran, Hadith tell us, our aql accepts. Whatever aql says, Quran and Hadith accept. So we don't have any conflict here. It's a very comfortable position, because for some people between aql and religion there is sometimes conflict. There are things that they believe which would not be acceptable to aql. We say no. We don't have anything in Islam which is against aql. Yes, we have things in Islam which are above aql. That's another issue. What is the difference between against aql and being above aql?
Above aql means that aql has not discovered the reason.
Means aql is silent. It's not that, aql never says something when doesn't have authority. If you ask aql something, and aql doesn't have authority. For example, because aql doesn't have enough data, aql keeps silent. It can be something very basic, like for example, if you ask aql, what is the taste of ice cream? Aql says, I don't have authority. Why you don't have authority? Because I don't have data. It's not something very difficult, but it's to be coming through perception. If you ask aql, how many people are in the next room? Aql keeps silent. It's not that aql makes a false judgment. Aql never makes false judgment. Aql keeps silent. If you ask aql about heaven, how many gates are for heaven? What are the blessings available in heaven? Aql keeps silent. So there are things that Aql cannot make judgment, but there is a hope that can collect information and make judgment. There are things that Aql can never hope to be able to understand because there is no way. But what is important is we don't have anything against judgment of Aql. Because if Aql makes a judgment, it's valid. Aql never makes a judgment without having good ground for that. Aql is Hujjah. Hujjah may be silent, but when he speaks, you have to follow. So there are cases that Aql is silent. We understand it from Wahy, from revelation. But it's not that Aql speaks, revelation speaks, and then they contradict. It's impossible. So, there is mulazama. There is a mutual relation or correlation between Aql and Shar'. كلما حكم به العقل حكم به الشرع. كلما حكم به الشرع حكم. Even this is something you can understand by Aql. You can understand it from sources in Quran and Hadith, but you can also understand it from Aql, that there is such mulazama. So, this is what is mentioned in the book. Then there is something that I would like to explain a little bit, in case you don't understand the Arabic. It says, هذه الملازمات العقلية هي كبريات القضايا العقلية التي بضمها إلى صغرياتها يتوصل بها إلى الحكم الشرعي. Page 89, the penultimate paragraph. Page 89 of Arabic, yeah? Penultimate paragraph. وعليه هذه الملازمات العقلية, these intellectual correlations, for example, necessity of muqaddamatul wajib and other things, ijza and so on and so forth, these are kubrayat, these are major premises, and when you add the minor premise, sughra, then you come to the conclusion. You know sughra and kubra? Yeah, in mantiq. Sughra, for example, we say, he is a human being, and every human being is mortal, for example. هو إنسان وكل إنسان فاني. So, صغرى is هو إنسان, كل إنسان فاني is كبرى. Okay? So, we take صغرى from aql or from religious sources, but we have a kubra, a major premise, which is from aql, like muqaddamatul wajib wajibu, and things like this. So, in other words, whenever faqih or mujtahid or jurist wants to understand the rulings which are not mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah, so Shari' Muqaddas, the sacred, the holy legislator has not mentioned them directly. There is no hadith about this, there is no text about this. We use our aql to see if there is a way to draw a conclusion out of available evidence. Available evidence can be purely intellectual or can be mixed. But it is aql that works on them to find out something about what we should do. So, this is about the ruling of aql and about mulazama. And he says, it's impossible to think that aql, the intellect, or uqala, the intellectual, the rational people. We are not talking about someone who is mad. We are not talking about someone whose mental, faculty doesn't work. If rational people, They make rational judgments, not emotional judgments, or false judgment. But if they use aql and logic, whatever they come to as a conclusion would be agreeable to religious authority, Allah and Prophet. Why? Because Allah Himself is Khaliqul Uqala wa Khaliqul Aql. He's the creator of aql and the intellectual people. Rasulullah is Ra'isul Uqala. He's the head of Uqala. So if there is something agreeable to all Uqala, definitely Rasulullah accepts that. Definitely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts that. Because aql is valid hujjah, valid proof. So if you don't have any direct communication in religion about something, but still you can find out through aql, that's fine. That helps you to understand your religious position. Then he says, ulama have set up some regulations and some rules in order to determine the intellectual correlation. For example, when it comes to mustaqillat aqliya, purely intellectual rulings, they talk about at-tahsinu wa-taqbih al-aqliyan. Inshallah, in Baba Hadi Ash, we'll have a discussion about this, and you will see more discussion, inshallah, coming. Basically, this is the idea of whether goodness and badness are essential or not, are intrinsic or not, and then whether they are intellectual or not. Al-husn wal-qubh, al-dhatiyan wal-aqliyan. There was a debate between Ash'arites and Shiites and Mu'tazilites. So Ash'arites on the one side, Shiites and Mu'tazilites, who were called Adliya, the people of justice. They were on the other side. Ash'arites had the idea that husn wal qubh, goodness and badness, are not objective, are not real. And there is no way, therefore, for us to understand them. God makes something good or bad. Therefore, we can only understand through religion. God says adl is good and zulm is bad. He could have said opposite. Which means adl and zulm in reality are not different. Externally, in real world, they are not different. When Allah says something is good, or when He says you must do it, it becomes good. He could have said differently. They wanted to preserve Allah's authority, but unfortunately they damaged Allah's wisdom and justice. Because this makes Allah's decisions arbitrary. And this means that those who are going to be punished, there is no adalah, there is no justice, because they were not able to understand before religion. For example, if someone is not a believer in Islam, why he should believe in Islam? If there is no moral responsibility that you can understand it by your aql, this person says, I don't want to inquire, I don't want to do any research, and still Islam is not proved for me. If there is no intellectual or independent way to say that you have to make inquiry, you have to bother about the truth, then he says, I don't want to inquire. So this idea, which looks nice, makes the whole question of faith problematic. It means that there is no way to expect people to become religious. It makes Allah's decision arbitrary. So, the Mu'tazilites and the Shia had the idea that al-husn wal-qubh ذاتيان. They are intrinsic. They are part of the essence of the actions. And therefore, because they are really different from each other, there is a way for us to reflect and discover, even before religion. Even if you are not a religious person, you are expected to understand at least the basics of morality. You don't need to be religious and realize that you should not do bad to people. You should, especially, for example, to vulnerable people. You should not take the money of an orphan or deceive an orphan and take his money. You don't need to be a religious person to understand these things. You don't need to be religious to understand that you should keep your promise. Okay? So, here the judgment about al-husn wal-qub is purely intellectual. We don't need any other source. We can rely totally on aql. And if we have religious texts about this, it would be for support, for emphasis, not part of the argument. Because aql here can make completely the job. For غير المستقلات العقلية, those things which are partially intellectual, not purely intellectual, we have few discussions. One is ijza, sufficiency. And that is when you do something either according to al-ahkam al-waqi'i or al-ahkam al-zahiri, al-awlawi, al-awwali or al-thanawi, and then later it is known to be different or the situation changes. Do we believe in ijza or not? Like for example, you did tayammum and said your prayer, then later your problem is solved, you have water or you are able to use water. Do you need to repeat salat? Do you need to do qaza? Or for example, your mujtahid issued fatwa, you acted upon it, later his fatwa changes. Do you need to repeat if the second fatwa says those actions are void? These are all discussed under ijza. Sufficiency means what has been performed is sufficient. You don't need to repeat, you don't need to do qadha. This is something that we will discuss later. But this is not mustaqillat, because part of it is religious, part of it is aqli. Because it's about ijza of something which has been done religiously.
So is there any difference between ajza and ijza?
Yes, ajza means parts. Ijza means sufficiency. Mujzi means sufficient. If you read the Risala Amaliyah of any marja, if it is in Farsi or Arabic, they say, inshallah, acting upon this book is mujzi.
Yes.
Va mubra'un lidhimma. Means it's sufficient and your responsibility, inshallah, is taken care of. Yes. So mujzi means sufficient. But ajza is different.
Yeah, that's part.
That's part.
From juz.
Yes.
What is Isa?
Ajza means it's sufficient. You don't need to do it again or you don't need to do it later. Muqaddamatul wajib. One of the discussions about muqaddamatul wajib is muqaddamatul wajib wajibun. When you have to do something and that cannot be done unless another thing is done. Like applying for visa for Hajj. Is this necessary or not? Azad. If two things are opposing each other, two rulings opposite each other, we have Zadd Am, Zadd Khas, inshallah we'll talk about it. Zaddul Am means, for example, you have to not to be here. For example, one ruling says you must say your prayer. Another ruling says you must not be here. This is Zadd Am. Zadd Khas means another one says not to say your prayer. Say prayer and not to say prayer. Zadd Khas, Zadd Am. If you are in a case that you have both opposing rulings, what is the judgment of Aql here? Ijtima'ul amr wal nahy. And that is when there is overlap. There is a command, there is prohibition, they overlap over certain cases. What should we do? Dalalatul nahi al fisal. As I said, if a prohibition has belonged to something, it can be ibadat, it can be mu'amalat. As I said, for example, sometimes it said that don't do this mu'amala. For example, if it is said on the day of Jum'ah, when Salatul Jum'ah is going on, dharul bay', you should not do business. Does it mean that if you do business, it's void, or still the business is valid, but you have just done something wrong? Or maybe a sin, if we say it's horma, if it's a makruh, it's just wrong. So, it's an issue of fasad, means void, being void. This transaction is void or not. Or for example, if you are told, la ta'kulur riba. So now, if you do riba, is this riba your money? If you have taken riba. Or if you have given riba and instead you have taken something, is the transaction valid? Or you have just committed sin? You know, if you say it's valid, means you have committed sin. If you say invalid, means committed sin, plus you have to give him back. So these are things that we will discuss according to the rulings of Aql. Sometimes for some of them, we have also guidelines from Sharia. So then we discuss it in two levels. According to Aql and according to Sharia. Like Ta'awud al-Taraji, we discussed it in two levels. Al-Asl al-Awwali and Sanawi. In any case, the general pattern is this. First,
Which page are you on?
pardon?
Which page are you on?
91.
91.
End of page 91. At-tariqatul amma. The general pattern, or general, if you want to translate it literally, general path, general way, is first, you have to make sure that there is mulazama. In your case, there is a mulazama. If you establish that there is mulazama, then you say, we have a general rule which says, كلما حكم به العقل حكم به الشارع. So we apply this rule to this case in which we have mulazama. So you say there is mulazama here, and the qaida of mulazama says that whatever is made by reason must be made by religion. So that mulazama is now religiously also significant. Not only it's intellectually significant and acceptable, it's also religiously acceptable. So you have come to your conclusion. Now we have to go through mustaqillat aqli and later mustaqillat غير المستقلات العقلية. مستقلات aqli means purely intellectual, and غير المستقلات partially intellectual. For mustaqillat aqli, we said the discussion is about what? About goodness and badness. Whether they are essential, intrinsic, objective, real or not. And secondly, whether we can understand them by our reason or not. If you say they are not real, then there is no way to understand it by aql. You have just to learn it from religion. But if you say they are real, then aql can reflect on them and maybe understand at least the basics of morality. So now we start the discussion about al-mu'amalat al-aqliyya. I only tell you one page of it at the beginning, and then we continue inshallah, next session. Before anything, we have many times told, we should clarify the concepts that we use. Conceptual clarification. Conceptual clarification is very important. So, before anything, we should understand what is husn and qub. So I explain this so that your mind is prepared for next week, inshallah. There are three ways that husn and qub are used. Only one of them is relevant to our discussion. So please be careful, because two of them are not controversial between Ash'arites and Mu'tazilites. Only one of them is where we have controversy or differences. The first meaning for husn and qub, or hasan and qabih. Husn means goodness, hasan means good. Qub means badness or ugliness, qabih means bad or ugly. You understand the difference? So we say husn qub or hasan wa qabih. Okay? Sometimes we mean to be pleasant. Al-mula'ama lit-taba' means to be pleasant or unpleasant. For example, sometimes you hear a voice or a noise. For example, a noise created by an instrument or a voice created by a human being. And you see, you like to listen or you don't like to listen. So hasan means that you like to listen. Qabih means you don't like to listen. Okay? For example, Allah says, "Inna ankara al-aswat la sawtul hamir." This is not for religious people. This is for everyone. You don't like to hear the voice of donkey. Okay? But if it is, for example, some birds, it's very nice. Or for example, some smell can be nice, like a rose, like jasmine. Some can be bad, like rubbish. So, sometimes we use husn wal qub in the sense of something which is pleasant to our nature or unpleasant. Is there here any disagreement that we can understand what is pleasant or not pleasant? No, there is no disagreement here. So this is not our discussion. Second, sometimes we use husn in the sense of perfection and qub in the sense of incompletion, imperfection, deficiency, fault. Again, here there is no disagreement. For example, if you have a knife which is very sharp, can help you in cutting, we say it's a good knife. What is a bad knife? Something that cannot cut. If you have a, I don't know, for example, car which runs very smoothly, is reliable, it's a good car, otherwise a bad car. Goodness and badness, or husn and qub in this sense, is not controversial. This is not what Ash'ari and Mu'tazilites, disagree. This is something we can understand by ourselves. So, the first sense, which is mula'amatu tab wa ghayru mula'amatu tab or munafarat tab, to be pleasant or unpleasant, is not controversial. The second meaning, to be perfect or complete or not to be perfect and complete, again, no problem. There is no controversy here. The third meaning is what Mu'tazilites and Shiites on the one hand and the Ash'arites on the other hand disagree. The whole issue of husn qub is here. Husn in the sense of something which is praiseworthy, and qub in the sense of being blameworthy. These are controversial. Moral goodness, moral badness, this is controversial. something that when you do it, you are praised. Something that when you do it, you are blamed, you are disliked. Ash'arites had the idea that if there was no religion, no communication from God, everything was equal. There was no difference between doing adl or not, doing ihsan or not, keeping promise or not, betraying or not. Everything was equal. It is because of religion that we have some list of good things and some list of bad things. Who created this list? Religion. But we say no. These lists are real. And religion has come to help us to have a better understanding. You understand the basic of it by your aql, but to complete, to make sure that you don't make mistake, to go into details, to know what to do when there are conflicts, you need religion. Otherwise, even without religion, you can understand the basics of akhlaq, and you are supposed to observe the basics of akhlaq, and it is by understanding and following those basics that you come to religion. Otherwise, you will not even be able to establish religion. So, there are three senses in which host and hope are used. Two of them are not controversial. Everyone accepts that we can understand by our aql. There is the third sense, which is host in the sense of something that is praiseworthy, and hope in the sense of something which is blameworthy, which is controversial. Some people say this is real, and therefore you have a chance to understand it to some extent. Some people say it's not real, it's created by God, it's commanded by God, and you can only learn it from religion. There is nothing in reality that you can have the hope of understanding by your aql. Inshallah, we continue this discussion
What do you
next
mean by
week. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.